There are moments in history that do not arrive with fanfare. They do not announce themselves with trumpets or breaking news alerts. They come quietly, in the bend of a hand, in the silence between two people standing close together in a crowded room, in the way one human being places their palm on the back of another and says, without a single word, "I am here. You are not alone. Keep going." The world has watched Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, for more than 2 decades. It has watched them fall in love in University Town, watched them marry beneath the grandeur of Westminster Abbey while the whole planet held its breath, watched them welcome 3 children who grew into faces the world recognized and adored. It watched them grieve together when the Queen was gone, watched them step into enormous shoes with something that looked impossibly like grace. And then, in the winter of 2024, it watched something it had never quite seen before. It watched a nation stop, not for a celebration, not for a coronation, but for a woman in black, a woman who had spent months fighting something that lives inside the body and does not care about titles or palaces or the weight of expectation, walking back into the public light for the first time in what felt like forever. And beside her, or just behind her, or arriving just before her with eyes that gave everything away, was a man who had sat in hospital corridors and sleepless rooms and carried the weight of the year he would later call the hardest of his life. What happened that November weekend in London was not a royal performance. It was not managed optics or carefully choreographed. It was something far more human than any of that. It was a husband who could not stop touching his wife's hand. It was a wife who looked up at the veterans in that hall and felt something crack open behind her eyes. It was a nation still raw, still grieving its own losses, still carrying the bruises of a strange and difficult year, that looked at 2 people on a balcony and in a royal box and on the steps of a war memorial and recognized something in them that it had almost forgotten it still believed in. This is that story. To understand what that November weekend meant, you have to go back to January. You have to start in the quiet before the storm, in the weeks when the Princess of Wales simply vanished from public life, and nobody knew why. She had undergone what Kensington Palace described as a planned abdominal surgery. The statement was measured, careful, stripped of detail in the way that royal statements always are, as if every word had been weighed on a scale before it was permitted to leave. The public was told she would be away from her duties for several months, that she was recovering well, that she was in good spirits, and yet something did not sit right. Britain is a country that has grown up alongside its royals. Generations of families have watched them at Christmas, cheered them at weddings, mourned them at funerals. There is a familiarity there that runs deeper than celebrity, something woven into the national identity in a way that is hard to explain to someone who did not grow up with it. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had become one of the most recognizable and beloved figures in that tapestry. She was 31 years old when she married into the family, 42 when she disappeared from it, and in the years between those 2 numbers, she had become something that mattered to people in ways they sometimes struggled to articulate. When she was gone, people noticed, not just in the way you notice an absence from a tabloid page. They noticed the way you notice when a light goes out in a house you walk past every morning. The world kept asking where she was, and the palace kept giving answers that answered nothing, and the silence between the questions and the non-answers grew heavier with every passing week. Then came March 22nd, 2024. A video, filmed in a garden, the kind of quiet, ordinary background that felt chosen deliberately for its softness. She sat facing the camera in a cream sweater, no crown, no jewels, no ceremony. Just a woman and a camera and a truth that had been carried alone for too long. She had cancer. The word landed like something thrown through a window. She explained that it had been discovered during the surgery, that it had come as a complete shock, that she had begun a course of preventative chemotherapy. She asked for privacy, for time, for the space to heal the way any mother and wife and human being needs to heal. She spoke clearly with a steadiness that seemed to cost something, the kind of steadiness that is not calm but is its close, exhausted cousin. And she looked into the camera with eyes that carried everything and gave away just enough, and the world felt the breath go out of it all at once. Within hours, the responses were everywhere. On social media, in newspapers, in the streets outside Kensington Palace, where people laid flowers they felt compelled to bring even though nobody had asked them to. Hashtag Pray for Kate appeared in trending feeds across dozens of countries. Messages came from presidents and strangers in equal measure. People who had never met her, would never meet her, people who lived in countries where the British monarchy meant almost nothing politically, sat at their kitchen tables and felt inexplicably like they had just heard something happen to someone they loved. What was it about her that did that to people? It was not just beauty, though she had it. It was not just the children, though they were adored. It was something in the way she had always occupied her role, not as a performance, but as something closer to a vocation. She had spent years visiting hospitals and schools and community centers, sitting on the floor with young children, holding the hands of people going through things she could not fully understand but tried very hard to meet with her whole self. She had spoken publicly about mental health at a time when royals simply did not do that. She had shown up for people quietly and consistently over so many years that the goodwill had accumulated into something that felt personal to millions of strangers. And now strangers were showing up for her. But the one person whose reaction mattered most to the watching world was William. He said almost nothing publicly in those first weeks. He stepped into the spaces where she could not be, attending engagements that had been on the calendar and could not easily be canceled, showing up with a particular kind of composed blankness that the royal family has always been trained to wear in public. He was present. He was dutiful. He was everything the institution required him to be. And yet, there were moments, small ones caught by cameras that were always watching. A reporter asked him, during one brief interaction, how he was. He paused, not the polished pause of a practiced public figure, but the real kind. The kind where someone is deciding, in real time, how much of the truth they are able to carry into the open air. "She's fighting," he said quietly. "We're taking it one day at a time." Those 6 words did what 1,000 press releases could not. They reminded people that behind the title, behind the suits, and the schedules, and the polished statements, there was a man who was afraid. A man who had married his best friend, and was now watching her fight something he could not fight for her, could only stand beside her and keep going when everything in him wanted to stop. A friend who knew the couple well told royal biographer Russell Myers that the diagnosis had been like being hit by a bus. One moment, life was normal, and the next, everything changed, the friend said. He worships her truly. She's his world, and when the diagnosis came, it was as if the ground beneath him vanished. The ground beneath him vanished. And still he stood on it. Every day, for months, inside the walls of Kensington Palace, the private reality was even more tender and more terrible than the public glimpses suggested. William and Catherine had 3 children, George, then 10, Charlotte, 9, and Louis, 6, who had to be told that their mother was ill, that she would have to go back to hospital. That mummy was sick in a way that was serious and real, and not the kind of sick that goes away in a few days with soup and television. Myers, in his book about the couple, described it as one of the hardest things they faced together. Not the diagnosis itself, not the surgeries or the chemotherapy or the months of medical uncertainty, but the moment of sitting with 3 children and finding words for something that has no good words. Parents of young children will understand this in their bones. The way you search desperately for language that is honest without being terrifying, that tells the truth without taking something irreplaceable from the child who is listening with their whole heart. By all accounts, Catherine insisted on being the one to tell them. Even in her weakest moments, she was the one who held the family together from the inside. She was the one who managed the emotional architecture of the household, who made sure the children felt safe and loved and normal even when nothing was normal. William held the outside together. She held the inside. They had always worked that way. And even in the hardest year of their lives, they kept working that way because it was the only way they knew how to keep standing. Through the spring and the summer and into the long, strange autumn, she moved through her illness mostly out of sight. There were rare glimpses, a photograph at Windsor released in June that was later criticized for appearing to have been edited, which threw fuel onto the wildfire of speculation, and a brief appearance at Trooping the Color in June where the nation held its breath until she smiled, and they released it all at once. She was there. She was thinner, perhaps, and quieter in her movements, but she was there, and to the people who loved her from a distance, there meant everything. She attended Wimbledon in July in a dress the color of cream and summery flowers, and the crowd rose to their feet, not in the polished, obligatory way crowds sometimes do, but in that uncontrollable way, the kind that happens when a feeling gets too large for the body to hold quietly. She smiled. She watched the tennis. She was ordinary in all the ways that mattered most. And somewhere in a broadcast truck, a camera operator held the shot a beat longer than strictly necessary, because they were human and they understood what they were watching. In September, she released a statement that the nation had been waiting for, with the particular hell-breath quality of people who are hoping but afraid to hope too much. She had completed chemotherapy. She was cancer-free, though the road ahead was long. She would be taking things slowly, one step at a time, with the kind of grateful ferocity of someone who had been given something back and intended never to take it for granted again. She wrote, of simply loving and being loved, and the simplicity of it, dropped into a statement otherwise full of careful royal language, hit people somewhere underneath the usual armor. William, who had described 2024 to actor Eugene Levy in a candid television conversation as the hardest year of his life, finally seemed to exhale. He said he was proud of her in the same breath that he said it had been dreadful. He said the word dreadful the way a person says it when they mean something far worse, but are not yet ready to find words that large. They were getting through it. Together, imperfectly, humanly, they were getting through it. And then November came. November in England is a country unto itself. The light changes first. It goes low and sideways, the kind of light that falls at an angle and turns ordinary things golden and a little melancholy. The leaves come down from the plain, trees in wet, heavy drifts. The pavements darken with rain that isn't quite cold enough to be dramatic, but is cold enough to be felt. And in the first week of November, across the whole of the United Kingdom, a particular quiet settles. Not the absence of sound, but a different quality to the sound that remains. Buses still run, people still laugh, markets still sell bread and flowers and cups of coffee. But underneath all of it is the awareness of something older, something that has been observed on this island for more than 100 years. Remembrance. The red poppy appears on lapels in the last days of October. Sold at every post office and church hall and train station, the proceeds go to veterans and service families. It is one of the few national rituals that has not been contested or diluted or turned into an argument. One of the few things that most of Britain still does together, quietly, without needing to be asked. You wear your poppy. You stand at 11 o'clock. You remember. The Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall is the emotional and ceremonial heart of this season. It takes place every year on the Saturday evening before Remembrance Sunday, and it is unlike almost any other event in the royal calendar. Not because of its grandeur, though the Albert Hall is magnificent and the production elaborate, but because of the feeling that lives inside it. Veterans sit in their seats with their medals pinned to chests that have held things that cannot be spoken in the ordinary course of a day. Families of the fallen are there. Widows, children, grandchildren who carry grief the way old would carry's rings, layer upon layer, invisible from the outside. Current serving personnel stand and march and are cheered by a crowd that is trying, in the only way available to it, to say thank you in a volume large enough to mean something. It is, in other words, an evening made of feeling. And on the evening of November 9th, 2024, the woman who walked into that hall walked in carrying her own. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had not been seen at a major royal event since Wimbledon in July. That was 4 months. For months of recovery, of chemotherapy completing, of hospital visits and rest, and the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a body that has been through something hard. She had attended one smaller engagement in October, A visit to Southport with William to meet families affected by the terrible knife attack that had killed 3 young girls that summer. But this was different. This was the first time she would be back on the royal stage in the full, formal sense, the first time the cameras and the crowds and the whole breathing weight of national attention would turn and find her there. The preparations that go into moments like this are never visible from the outside, but they are extensive. The hair, the dress, the jewelry, each chosen not randomly, but with purpose, each carrying meaning that will be read and written about and discussed by a nation of people who have learned over years that what the royal family wears is never just clothes. She wore black, all black, from the collar of her coat dress to the tips of her shoes. The deep, serious black of mourning and respect. The coat had been worn before, years earlier, a piece originally by Catherine Walker that had been carefully reworked, its fringe removed, its buttons replaced, a velvet bow added at the collar. This was not carelessness about detail. It was something else entirely. It was continuity. It was the choice of a woman who understood that in this particular role, on this particular evening, it was not about being new or impressive or fashion-forward. It was about being right. She wore a single red poppy. She wore poppies every remembrance, but this year people looked at them differently. And then the jewelry. 2 pieces that stopped every room they entered, not for their price or their famous names, but for what they said. On her ears, Princess Diana's diamond drop earrings. The ones the world first fell in love with on a young woman in the 1980s. The ones that had been worn through so many evenings that now felt like chapters of a single story. Around her throat, a Monica Venator pearl necklace. On her finger, for the first time in months, the engagement ring. The famous sapphire and diamond ring that had been Diana's. The one that William had offered Catherine on a lake in Kenya. The one that the world had watched on her hand across 14 years of public life. The ring had been absent in some of the previous months' sparse appearances, whether from weight loss or medical necessity, or simply the private logistics of a year that had nothing to do with public appearances. It had not always been there. Now it was back, and the cameras found it with the helpless certainty of cameras that know what they're looking for, and the people watching found it with the helpless certainty of people who needed to see it. She was back. All of her. Outside the Royal Albert Hall, people had gathered on the pavement. Not in the enormous numbers of a coronation or a royal wedding, but in the smaller, quieter way that felt, in its own right, like a statement. They wore poppies. They held their phones up to record. And when the car arrived, and the door opened, and Catherine stepped out, the sound that rose from the crowd was not the organized roar of a formal occasion. It was something more unguarded, a rush of warmth, of recognition, of relief. She was dressed for the occasion, but she was also unmistakably herself. And then a camera caught what no official schedule or protocol or press release had planned for anyone to notice. In the moments before they entered the hall, as they moved through the brief gathering of dignitaries and greetings that precedes every formal engagement, something small happened. Catherine turned slightly to acknowledge someone or to speak, or simply because movement draws the body in the directions it needs to go, and in that moment, her hand found the small of William's back. Not a posed touch, not the choreographed display that public figures sometimes offer when they know the cameras are there. Just her hand, moving to that particular place on his back the way hands move to familiar places, the way the body knows certain geographies by heart. A beat later, William's hand moved to the small of hers. The gesture lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was seen by everyone. A royal commentator watching the footage described William's behavior that evening as solicitous and protective in a very understandable way. She noted that he is not known for expressing his emotions in visible gestures, and that there was an element of reassurance in the way he was behaving. She connected it directly to what he had said just days earlier, that the year had been brutal, that he had barely slept, that he had been managing his fear for Catherine alongside his fear for his father, King Charles, who was also undergoing cancer treatment, and who sat in the royal box that evening still fighting his own private battle. It is connected to what he said about this being a brutal year, the commentator said. He was going to a big event with her where she was going to be on display. And He wanted her to know he was there. He wanted her to know he was there. Those 8 words contain an entire marriage. Inside the Albert Hall, the evening unfolded the way these evenings always do, with music and performance and testimony, with the particular combination of pride and grief that is the emotional signature of remembrance. Tom Jones was there, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Current serving personnel moved across the floor in formations that carried their own language, the precise grammar of military ceremony that civilians recognize without fully understanding. Veterans sat in their rows with the careful stillness of people who have learned to be still in the presence of things that are very large. And at some point during the evening, during a standing ovation for a group of veterans, the cameras found Catherine's face. She was emotional, not devastated, not weeping, but moved in that visible, involuntary way that happens when something bypasses the careful management of public life and goes straight through to the person underneath the role. Her eyes were bright. Her jaw held the particular tension of someone keeping themselves together and doing it, but only just. She was applauding. She was standing. She was doing everything the role required. And she was feeling it. All of it. People watching from living rooms across the country felt something tighten in their own throats in response. Because they knew, without needing anyone to explain it, what she was carrying into that hall. They knew about the surgery and the diagnosis and the months of treatment and the children who had been told their mother was ill. They knew about William's confession of brutality and sleepless nights. And they understood in a deep, wordless way that human beings understand things about each other when they're paying close attention, that the emotion on her face was not just about the veterans in the room, though it was genuinely that too. It was about being alive. It was about being back. It was about the particular, overwhelming feeling of walking into a room that is full of people who have lost things that cannot be returned, and knowing with a ferocity that you did not have a year ago, how much you have not lost, how much is still there, how much you still have to hold. Beside her, William watched. He watched the performances. He watched the veterans. He watched the room. And he watched her. Not constantly, not obviously, but with that particular quality of attention that belongs only to people who love each other with a practiced depth of more than a decade. The glances were brief, but they were there, and the cameras, which see everything, caught them. The nation, watching from its living rooms and its phones, caught them too. By the end of that Saturday evening, the images had spread across the internet with the particular velocity of things that meet and need people did not know they had. Her return, his hand, her eyes, full and bright during the standing ovation, the sapphire ring, the Diana earrings, the moment of 3 seconds at the door, 2 hands finding 2 backs. Social media did what social media does in moments like this. It overwhelmed. How regal yet down-to-earth you both are. One person wrote on the official Whale social media post. Perfection, and so sensitive to the occasion, wrote another. The epitome of class, said a third. And beneath all the formal language, beneath the reverence and the praise, there was something else, something simpler, more urgent, more human. People were just glad she was there. The morning of Remembrance Sunday is different from the night before. The Festival of Remembrance has music and performance and the particular warmth of a great indoor gathering. Remembrance Sunday at the Cenotaph has none of that. It is the stripped-down version, the one from which all the production value has been removed. What remains is just the ceremony itself, austere, precise, wordless in its most essential moments, and the weather, which in London in November is very rarely kind, and the people who come in their thousands and stand in the gray morning air and hold themselves very still. The Cenotaph stands on Whitehall, a plain stone monument that says almost nothing on its face and everything in what it represents. It was built after the First World War as a monument to the glorious dead, a phrase that has always carried attention inside it. The word glorious doing uncomfortable work beside the word dead. Over the decades, it has become the place where the country gathers to do the thing it finds hardest to do in its ordinary life. To stop and feel something without reaching immediately for a way to manage it or move past it. On November 10th, 2024, Catherine stood on the balcony of the Foreign Office overlooking Whitehall in the gray morning light, and she stood there for a long time. She wore black again, the same serious, purposeful black as the night before. The Catherine Walker coat, reworked and returned to service. The same pearl necklace. And, pinned to her chest, the regimental brooch of the Irish Guards, a piece that had belonged to the Queen Mother, first worn by her in 1959, passed down through the decades into Catherine's keeping. The Queen Mother had worn it for 40 years. Catherine wore it now, on a morning when the air felt heavy with the weight of things that outlast the people who carry them. These are not random choices. Every piece of clothing and jewelry on that balcony was a sentence in a language that the royal family has always spoken with its appearance. Diana's earrings from the night before. The Queen Mother's brooch this morning. Two women who had shaped what this family is. Two women who are no longer there to stand in this place, present in their absence through the small things that were left behind. It is possible to be skeptical of this kind of symbolism. It is possible to look at it from a certain angle and see only carefully managed image-making, the considered deployment of heirloom jewelry as emotional shorthand. That reading exists, and it is not entirely wrong. But something happens when skepticism meets the reality of what was on that woman's face. Because Catherine was not performing remembrance that morning. She was inhabiting it. She had spent the better part of a year living in the kind of uncertainty that is normally reserved for the private rooms of ordinary life. The hospital waiting rooms, and the 3 a.m. awakenings, and the conversations with your husband where neither of you can find the right thing to say, and so you just sit together in the inadequacy of silence, and let that be enough. She had been ill in a way that is no respecter of titles or crowns or the particular weight of royal expectation. Her body had fought something while the world watched the door of her house from the pavement, and her children went to school, and try to be children, and her husband kept standing up and showing up because the alternative to standing up and showing up was not one he was willing to consider. She had come out the other side, cancer-free, as of September, still on a long road, still taking it one day at a time, still in the careful early months of what she called her path to healing, but alive, here, on a balcony on a gray November morning, in the coat of a woman who had been dead for more than 2 decades, wearing earrings that had been worn by a woman who died in a tunnel in Paris when William was 15 years old. Alive in the middle of all that gone. When the last post sounded across Whitehall, the silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it. Not empty, but full, packed with the weight of everything that everyone in that street was holding and not saying. 2 minutes. The whole country, in its scattered way, stopping at once. Traffic halted. Conversations interrupted. People in supermarkets and sitting rooms and office buildings where someone remembered to mention the time standing still for 2 minutes, which is a very long time when you're holding still with something real. Catherine stood in that silence on the balcony. Beside her stood Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, who has been one of the quieter pillars of the royal family through a year that has required a great many pillars. They had stood together the night before. They stood together now. And when the ceremony concluded, when the wreaths had been laid, and the hymn sung, and the silence observed, and the moment given its full weight, and the king and the other senior royals began to move back inside, Sophie turned to Catherine and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Another 3-second gesture. Another touch that lasted no time at all, and said everything. The body language experts and the royal commentators and the people watching from their televisions analyzed it afterward the way such things always get analyzed. But analysis is the wrong tool for moments like this. You cannot take apart a moment of human tenderness and reassemble it into something that makes more sense than the original. The original, a woman who had just come through months of illness, standing at the National Memorial in the gray November air, and another woman who had stood beside her through much of it, offering the only thing available in that moment, which was the simple, wordless fact of her presence, and her hand was already the whole of it. There was nothing more to understand. There was only something to feel. William, for much of Remembrance Sunday, was elsewhere in the formal sense. His role in the ceremony placed him in different positions, fulfilling different obligations. He took the salute as troops marched past. He moved through the ceremony in the way the future King of England is required to move through it, with the particular combination of solemnity and readiness that the role demands. But the camera still found him looking, still found those brief glances across the distance of the formal procession that said, without saying, that he knew where she was, and that knowing mattered to him. He had called the year brutal. He had said dreadful. He had said hardest. He had run out of enough synonyms for difficult to express what the year had actually cost. So he had fallen back on the plain ones, the short ones, the Anglo-Saxon ones that carry weight precisely because they are so spare. What he did not say, what he had never said publicly in all the months of managing himself with the careful self-possession that is both his nature and his training, was the thing that the gesture at the Albert Hall door had already said, the thing that the glances across the room had said, the thing that showed in his face when he looked at her during the standing ovation, when he watched her watching the veterans with her eyes full and her hands together. He loved her. He had been afraid. And she was there. There is a particular kind of love that only becomes visible after difficulty. Not the love of courtship, which is all brightness and attention, or the love of early marriage, which is still discovering its own shapes, but the love that has been tested in the specific ways that illness and fear and sustained uncertainty tested. The love that has sat through difficult conversations and held its ground, that has been frightened and kept going anyway, that has watched someone suffer and been unable to fix it and love them anyway, more deeply, more quietly, with less performance and more constancy because the suffering stripped away everything that was not essential and left only what was true. That was what people saw on William's face. Not the composed heir to the throne, not the polished representative of an ancient institution, not the man who had grown up in the relentless visibility of a global media ecosystem and learned very young how to control what his face gave away. They saw beneath all of that the husband, the man who had stood in the places his wife could not stand for most of the year, who had slept badly and worried constantly and told the world it had been brutal because he could not quite bring himself to say the word that was larger than that. And they saw her, this woman who had written in her September statement about the simple yet important things in life that so many of us often take for granted, about loving and being loved, who had said that her path to healing was long and that she intended to take each day as it came, but that she was entering the new phase with a renewed sense of hope and appreciation of life. She had been speaking about herself, but millions of people had read that statement and recognized something in it that was also about them, because 2024 had been hard for a lot of people. Not in the same way, not with the same specific weight of a cancer diagnosis in a famous family observed by the entire world, but hard in the ordinary ways that years can be hard. Losses, illnesses, relationships under strain, the exhaustion of getting through things that were not supposed to be this difficult. The particular kind of grief that comes not from a single terrible moment, but from the accumulation of difficult months, each one a little heavier than the last, until the whole year sits on you like something you cannot put down. And here were two people, two enormously privileged, enormously visible, enormously scrutinized people, who had also, in their own way, been carrying something too heavy, who had also, in their own way, been taking it one day at a time, who had also found themselves stripped down to the simple and important things, to loving and being loved, to the daily work of just staying and showing up and keeping going. That recognition is what touched people, not the glamour or the titles or the magnificence of the Albert Hall or the solemnity of the cenotaph, but the fundamental human fact of two people who had been frightened together and had kept choosing each other in the daily, unglamorous, uncelebrated way that love actually works, and who had come on this gray November weekend to stand in public together in mourning for the fallen, carrying their own private mourning for the year they had survived and their private gratitude for what had not been lost. The wreath Catherine laid at the cenotaph was red and formal and placed with precision, the way wreaths are placed in a ceremony that has been practiced and perfected over 100 years. But the act behind it, a woman who had been told she had cancer, who had fought and come through, who stood now at a monument to people who did not survive the things they faced, carried something the ceremony itself could not contain. She stood in the November gray, and she was there. And the nation, which had been afraid for her in the way a nation can be afraid for someone who belongs to it in some unspoken way, looked at her standing there and felt, all at once, the specific relief of something that had been clenched for months finally, carefully, beginning to open. The poppies fell from the ceiling of the Albert Hall. The last post rang across Whitehall. The crowd stood in the gray morning with their red flowers on their lapels, and somewhere in the middle of all that remembrance, something was being quietly celebrated too. She was alive. He was beside her. And for a nation that had spent a year holding its breath, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.